Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be here in the presence of distinguished colleagues. Let me add a footnote to Christoph's excellent introduction. And in doing so, I'd like to make a comparison between two countries, if you want, at the periphery of Europe. One is in the southeast, that's Greece, and the other one is in the southwest, which is Portugal. And I think Portugal has today a similar GDP per capita as Greece, and also has a very checkered history with its public debt. It has also defaulted several times in the 19th century. Perhaps in the 20th century it was luckier because it didn't participate in the Second World War. But it is certainly also a country with a problematic history of foreign debt. Now, what I want to emphasize is that the difference lies very often in how a country reacts to a crisis situation. And let me illustrate that with two variables. One of which Christoph already mentioned, that when you have a country with a low savings rate, then you quickly get into a situation where the country runs a current account deficit, because otherwise you can't finance a decent level of domestic investment. Now, the interesting fact for me, at least, about the savings rate in Greece is that depending on the period you look at, actually it used to be high. In the 1990s, up to 2000, Greece actually was a high savings rate economy. And what is interesting or astonishing is that for reasons which I have difficulties to fathom, this savings rate went down way before euro area entry, and then went down even more during the boom years preceding the bust. But then what I find even more interesting is that if you compare that to Portugal, which traditionally had lower savings rate, when the crunch came, in Portugal savings were more or less maintained, whereas in Greece they declined even further. And of course, if you have that kind of reaction, then you get into a sort of vicious circle. Exactly at the time when you need more domestic resources to repay your creditors and also to invest in your own future, domestic savings become scarcer. And that, of course, makes the possibility to repay your foreign debt even more remote, increases the risk premium that foreign creditors will ask for, and of course that has a further negative impact. So it is not so much the level of Greek savings, which were, as I said, high but then declining, but it's the reaction to the crisis which made things worse. And the second aspect where, again, one sees the reaction to the crisis is the openness of the economy. The Greek economy has been rather closed for a long time, for reasons that are for me very difficult to understand, because after all, it's a very small economy, and economists always say small open economy, whereas Greece was at least a very small, relatively closed economy. And since you repay foreign debt with exports basically, or an excess of exports over imports, this is very important because with an open economy, it's easier to generate the increase in exports. And here again, the contrast between Portugal and Greece is striking, at least for the last crisis. After the crisis, in Portugal, exports started to grow very quickly. Portugal, which was already a more open economy than Greece, became even more open. And these exports were instrumental also in limiting the fall in GDP and the increase in unemployment. Whereas in Greece, exports really for the first years increased very little, although actually Greek wages went down much more than Portugal. And here again, of course, we have a sort of not positive circle, at least, in the sense that when the going gets tough, when you have to repay your foreign creditors, and when you actually need more exports, it didn't happen in Greece. Whereas it happened in other countries. And I submit to you that this different reaction to a crisis was the reason why Portugal was able to graduate, right? It was also a default-prone country, but basically it came at least to this crisis. It came under stress, but it came out without having to default, whereas Greece did. And I would therefore propose to you that we should really look at how the country reacts to tough times. If tough times lead to less savings and not a vigorous export growth, then the country is just not prepared for crisis. And that should make us think when we look at the very high level of Greek debt, which for the time being I know is no problem, but what will come later when the debt slowly graduates into private hands, and 20, 30 years from now when we have the next crisis? Would Greece then be better prepared?